Gavin Holt stood in the shadow of the medbay's dim light, watching Elara. His hands were full of tools, the hum of machinery in the background a constant reminder of the endless work ahead. The moonlight through the large window cast a soft glow, but even with the tranquility outside, the medbay felt unusually heavy tonight. There were quiet alarms that buzzed in the distance, a steady pulse of urgency he couldn't ignore. Elara was at the center of it all. She worked with a grace that made him pause every time he watched her. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, but there was a subtle tremor in them as she adjusted the diagnostic equipment. He noticed it first when she set down a medical scanner, her fingers twitching slightly as if they were too heavy for her own body. It wasn't something she could hide, not from him. It was a quiet kind of vulnerability, one that made his chest tighten. He hadn't meant to stand there for so long. But seeing her like this, when she thought no one was looking, struck him deeply. Elara was the kind of woman who never asked for help, not even when she clearly needed it. She kept everything to herself, tucked away behind a facade of stoic professionalism. And for the first time since they met, Gavin realized that it wasn't strength that kept her distant, it was fear. The opportunity was rare, and he had to act. He stepped forward, his boots soft against the floor. Elara didn't hear him approach until he was almost beside her. She stiffened, a quick glance over her shoulder revealing nothing but indifference. She was good at that, keeping people at arm's length. "I could help with that," Gavin offered, keeping his tone light. She didn't respond immediately, just continued working with the medical equipment, her focus so intense it bordered on obsession. Gavin let the silence stretch, watching her as she worked through a problem she was clearly struggling with. "Is it broken?" Gavin asked, his voice carefully neutral. Elara hesitated. He could see her muscles tense, that instant where she weighed her options. She could brush him off, pretend everything was fine, or she could acknowledge that she wasn't invincible. It was a choice she didn't make easily. "I've got it," she said, turning back to the console. Her tone was sharp, too sharp, and Gavin almost stepped away, but something in him stopped. He couldn't walk away this time. He needed to help her. "It's okay," Gavin said, walking closer. "I don't mind." He placed a hand on the control panel next to hers, his fingers lightly brushing hers. A simple touch. But it was enough to make her freeze. The tension in the room thickened, a sudden awareness crackling in the air. Elara's breath caught, her shoulders tightening under the weight of his proximity. For a long moment she didn't speak, and neither did he. They just stood there, the hum of the medical equipment the only sound between them. Gavin pulled back his hand, trying to keep his voice calm. "I just didn't want you to struggle alone." Elara's gaze met his for the first time that night, and for a split second, Gavin saw something in her eyes, something raw, something she tried so hard to hide. It was the slightest crack in her wall. He knew she wouldn't admit it aloud, but he saw it, the fear of needing someone. "I don't need anyone," Elara said, her voice colder now, but it lacked conviction. "I've managed just fine." Gavin understood the words, but not the meaning. "You don't have to manage everything alone. You shouldn't." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and Gavin saw how she clenched her fists. "I'm not fragile," she snapped, a little too defensively. He knew then that her walls were high and thick. But they weren't invincible. He would find a way in, even if it meant walking carefully, pushing gently. But for now, he only nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll just make the repairs on the terminal then." Elara didn't protest as he sat beside her, sliding into the chair with a quiet ease. His movements were deliberate, giving her space, but staying within her orbit. She didn't push him away this time. Gavin set his tools to work, his hands deftly moving through the intricate systems of the medbay's diagnostics. He could feel her presence beside him, her breath soft and shallow. He didn't try to fill the silence, he simply let it exist. He worked, and she watched. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching out between the two of them, until he could sense the subtle shift in her energy. "You don't have to do this," Elara said, her voice quieter now, as if the walls she'd built were starting to crack. I'm not doing this for you, Gavin replied, his voice gentle but firm. I'm doing it because I want to help. For a moment, she said nothing. Her gaze drifted away, focusing on something else in the room. Her fingers played with the edge of her sleeve, a nervous gesture. Why do you care? Elara asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. She wasn't looking at him anymore, but he could tell she was vulnerable now, more than she had been before. Gavin paused, his own gaze softening. He met her eyes, and this time, there was no hesitating. Because you're important. And no one should feel like they have to carry everything on their own. It was the truth, simple and quiet, but it held weight. For a second, Elara looked almost lost. She was used to people being distant, used to dealing with things alone. Gavin's words broke through that isolation, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. Not everyone wants to help, she murmured. Maybe not, Gavin said, focusing on the terminal. But I do. A soft silence settled between them. Elara's breath slowed, her shoulders relaxed just a little. She glanced at him, and this time, there was no sharpness in her gaze, only something softer, something that hadn't been there before. I don't know how to ask for help, she admitted, almost to herself. You don't have to ask, Gavin said, his voice warm and steady. I'm here. For the first time, Elara didn't argue. Instead, she sat back, letting him work, and for a few moments, they were simply two people in a quiet room, sharing a moment of connection neither had expected but both needed. It wasn't much, just a touch, just a few words, but it was enough. Enough to start something new. The ship's corridor was cold, the kind of cold that seemed to seep through your bones and make everything feel just a little too distant. Gavin's boots echoed against the metal floor as he walked toward the galley, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop. His thoughts drifted back to Elara, the way her hand had brushed his, how her walls had crumbled just slightly in that moment. She didn't want to admit it, but she'd let him in, if only just a little. But now, things felt different. The weight between them had shifted, and neither of them seemed sure of how to move forward. He knew her well enough by now to understand that her pride was a wall she built for good reason. But it wasn't impenetrable, not entirely. Gavin stepped into the galley, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixing with the faint metallic scent of the ship. He reached for a mug, taking a moment to savor the warmth of the ceramic in his hands. His mind wasn't on the coffee, it was on the tangled mess that was Elara's heart. She had let him help, yes, but she hadn't allowed him to see the real reason behind her struggle. Before he could take a sip, he heard the door slide open, and his gaze lifted to meet hers. Elara, he said, his voice steady despite the sudden rush of awareness that swept over him. She didn't reply right away, just stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her eyes were dark, deep, as if there was something she was wrestling with. He could see it in her body language, the way her shoulders were tight, the slight clench of her jaw. Can I join you? She asked, her voice cool but with a hint of something else beneath it, something hesitant, unsure. Gavin nodded, motioning toward the seat at the table. Of course. She stepped in, her presence commanding yet somehow fragile. He watched as she settled into the chair, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the table, a nervous energy he hadn't seen before. A few moments passed before either of them spoke. Gavin wanted to ask her about what happened the night before, about her walls, about why she pushed people away, but he held back. The silence between them stretched out, but it wasn't uncomfortable, not entirely. I've been thinking, Elara began, her voice breaking the silence. About what you said. About needing help. Gavin lifted his eyes to hers, his heart skipping a beat. She was looking at him now, the weight of her words heavier than anything he'd expected. And? I don't need anyone, she said, the words coming out more sharply than she intended. I don't. I've survived this long alone, haven't I? He didn't flinch, though the words stung. He knew she was trying to convince herself more than him. Surviving is different from living, he said quietly. You can survive, sure. But living requires connection. It requires letting people in. Elara looked away, her gaze drifting to the far wall. Her eyes held a distant, haunted quality, the kind that made Gavin wonder what had been buried deep inside her for so long. "What's the difference?" she asked after a moment, her voice soft, as if she were unsure whether she wanted to hear the answer. "The difference is trust," Gavin said, leaning forward slightly. "When you trust someone, you don't have to carry everything alone. You let them help you, not because you're weak, but because you believe they'll understand. And sometimes you need to be understood." Elara's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Gavin thought she might argue, but instead, she just sat there, the silence thickening. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was laden with the weight of unspoken truths. "Why are you so sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you so sure I can trust you?" Gavin's gaze softened. "Because I trust you." Her eyes snapped to his, but this time, there was something else in them, curiosity, maybe even the slightest flicker of hope. It made Gavin's heart tighten in his chest. This was more than just a conversation. This was a battle of wills, of past traumas and hidden scars that neither of them had been ready to face until now. Elara opened her mouth as if to say something, but then she closed it again, looking down at her hands, folding and unfolding them in her lap. Gavin felt his own uncertainty rise, the urge to comfort her pressing against him like a weight he didn't know how to lift. "Look, I know you're not ready for this," he said after a long pause. "I know you're scared. But you don't have to face this alone. You don't have to carry that weight on your own shoulders anymore." Elara's chest rose and fell in a slow, measured breath, and for a moment she seemed lost in thought. Gavin waited, giving her the space she needed. It wasn't his place to force her into anything. He couldn't make her trust him, couldn't make her open up. But he could be there, waiting patiently, until she was ready to take that step. "I never asked for this," she said finally, her voice almost drowned by the weight of her emotions. "I never asked for anyone to care." "I know," Gavin replied gently. "But it's not about asking. It's about choosing." Her eyes met his then, and for the first time, there was no distance between them, not the usual wall she had so carefully built. It was raw, vulnerable, and unspoken, but it was there. "I don't know if I can," she admitted softly, the words catching in her throat. "I don't know if I can trust you with all of me." Gavin leaned in, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to give me all of you. Just let me have a piece. A chance. That's all I'm asking for." The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was quiet with understanding, as if the two of them were finally speaking the same language. Elara didn't say anything more, but the way she looked at him told him everything he needed to know. The walls weren't gone, not yet, but they were starting to crack. And that was enough for now. The evening sun filtered through the large observation window, casting a soft glow on the metallic surfaces of the ship. The hum of the engines was quieter now, almost soothing, and the gentle rocking of the vessel made everything feel strangely calm. But inside the small quarters, tensions still simmered between Gavin and Elara, unspoken and undeniable. Gavin sat at the edge of the desk, staring at his hands, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite organize. He had done what he could to make Elara feel safe, to let her see that he wasn't just a passing moment. But the more he tried to reach her, the more it seemed she pulled away. Each step forward felt like a dozen steps back. Elara stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She hadn't said much since their conversation in the galley, and her silence only made the growing distance between them feel more pronounced. Gavin could feel it. Her walls still stood, strong as ever, but the cracks were beginning to show. The question was whether she would let him in before it was too late. "Are you ever going to tell me what's really going on with you?" Gavin asked, his voice soft but firm. It was a question that had been eating at him for days. "You can't keep hiding from this, Elara. You can't keep pretending it's not there." Her back stiffened, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, with a sharp exhale, she finally turned to face him. Her eyes were cold, almost guarded. But there was something else in them too, something deeper. I don't need saving, Gavin, she said, her voice tight. I don't need anyone to fix me. I'm not broken. Gavin stood, his own frustration bubbling to the surface. I never said you were broken, he replied, his tone a little harsher than he intended. But you're hurting, and you're not alone. You don't have to carry it all by yourself. Ilara's eyes flicked away, focusing on the far wall as if it could give her some kind of answer. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Gavin could almost hear the inner turmoil in her thoughts, the same battle she had been fighting alone for so long. But this time, he wasn't going to let her win by shutting him out. Ilara, please, he said, his voice quieter now, pleading. Let me in. Let me help. You don't have to do this alone. Her eyes met his again, and there was a flicker of something there, vulnerability, fear, but also something else. She took a slow, measured step forward, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know how, she admitted, her shoulders sagging for just a moment. I don't know how to let anyone in. I've been on my own too long. Gavin stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The distance between them was still there, but it was less than it had been before. She was willing to admit something, to open up in a way that felt like a breakthrough. And that small crack in her armor was all he needed. You don't have to have all the answers right now, Gavin said, his voice gentle. You don't have to know how to trust me. I'm not asking for you to give me everything all at once. Just let me be here. That's enough for me. Ilara closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to steady herself. When she opened them again, there was something softer in her expression, an acceptance, perhaps, or maybe just a willingness to try. I'm scared, she whispered. Scared of what it means to need someone. Scared of what will happen if I let myself care. I don't want to lose that part of myself, Gavin. Gavin's heart ached at the rawness of her words. He could see it now, the fear that had kept her distant for so long. It wasn't just about trust, it was about the fear of being vulnerable, of being exposed. And yet, she was standing here, telling him this, even if only in fragments. You don't lose yourself by caring for someone, he said softly, stepping closer until there was only a few inches between them. You only lose yourself when you stop allowing yourself to feel. It's okay to be afraid. But you don't have to face that fear alone. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she looked like she might retreat again, like she might pull away from the connection they had just started to build. But then, something in her shifted. She didn't move away. Instead, she stepped into his space, just a fraction closer. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely audible. Why do you care so much? What do you want from me, Gavin? It was the question he had been waiting for, the one that would finally lay bare the truth of his feelings. He had never been great at expressing his emotions, never known the right words when it came to matters of the heart. But in this moment, there was no room for hesitation. I want you, he said, his voice raw with sincerity. Not the broken parts. Not the parts you think you have to hide. I want you, your heart, your strength, everything that makes you you. And I'm not going anywhere, Ilara. I'm not leaving until you know that. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she didn't look away. There was no more anger, no more walls, just a raw honesty between them that felt as if it had been building for years. For a long moment, they stood there, suspended in time, two souls finally understanding each other in the quietest, most profound way. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Ilara's hand reached out to touch his. It wasn't much, a simple touch, the brush of her fingers against his, but it felt like everything. I don't know how to do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I'm willing to try. Gavin's heart swelled with emotion. This was all he could ask for, this willingness, this fragile hope that they could find something real, even amidst the scars of their pasts. The fear was still there, but it wasn't as loud as it had been before. They were finally standing together, even if just for a moment, and that was enough to make Gavin believe that love could be possible, even in the most unexpected of places. I'll be here, he said, his voice steady. Every step of the way. And for the first time, Ilara didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself believe in the possibility of what they could be.